Welcome to Previously on X-Men,
the podcast that looks back on X-Men comics, movies, shows, characters, and more. Oh, I keep going.
Eric?
Yeah, I keep going. You can find more about this show and others like it at our network's website, radiomeanwhile.com. Other shows on the network include 3 Nice Things, where we force ourselves to say 3 nice things about a movie with a bad and often earned reputation, Radio 64, Video Game Music Remix Radio, and 9021 Here We Go, a 90210 Rewatch podcast. You can share your thoughts on this and upcoming episodes by following us on Facebook and Twitter at Previously on X. Please rate, subscribe, and share this show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. I'm Eric Mickles, known online as Dusk vs. Tweak. With me is my co-host,
Hilary Gunning.
Today,
Known online as Hilary Gunning.
You are known online as Hilary Gunning. Everywhere, really. Online, offline.
I'm very well known in my very small community as Hilary.
Were the Matrix real? Would you just go by Hilary? Like if he was like, I'm Neo, this is Trinity, and you are, and you'd be like, I'm Hilary.
No. If Matrix is real, I'm going cool.
Okay. Yeah.
Handle. I'm obsessing over that for a few days.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the Matrix today. Today, we're actually talking to Eric and Julia Lewald.
Yeah, we are.
Eric was the showrunner of the 90s X-Men animated series, and Julia wrote for multiple episodes of that, and they were both involved in different elements as well of the show. And if you're following the X-Men animated series Twitter handle, then you're following them. So
they're great at Twitter. I love them on Twitter.
Yes, they're very active, and
they're so active.
Very it's nice. Like we sometimes we'll say something and they'll get a like from them, and I'm like, yes, I did it. They agreed to do an interview. We sat down to talk with them about the first season, which we just finished on our rewatch. Because as we say, we talk about the comics, the movies, and the shows, characters, and more. So yeah, we had them on to talk about the first season, talk about getting it to air and some of the decisions they've made, some of the questions we had while we were watching this show, wondering, who was in charge of that. And it was a lot of fun.
It was great fun. Yeah. So if you've been hearing our random questions about the animated series throughout the season, you can listen ahead and we might pose some of them.
All right. So we will play the interview now. Okay, so we're here with Eric and Julia Lewald. Eric, you were the showrunner of the X-Men animated series.
Yes, he was.
Yes. And Julia, you wrote for the actual episodes.
Yes, I did.
Okay. And for season 1, Julia, that would be Days of Future Past Part 1.
Indeed it would be, yes.
Okay, before we get into our specific questions for season 1, I'd love to ask just how you two got involved with the show back in the 90s.
Well, we each came out to California from not very different places, but from different places. I grew up in Texas and was determined to make my way to Hollywood somehow. Clawed my way out here. Took 10 years trying to crack into the writing industry. Mm-hmm. First job was, the first opportunity I was able to make happen was with Disney Afternoon, with Chip 'n Dale's Rescue Rangers, those shows. And that's where I met
me, Eric, who came out here from Tennessee. And I got started a couple of years earlier in early '85 at Hanna-Barbera. I was on staff there for a while with the Transformer competition, Challenge of the GoBots. Was my first opportunity, and it just happened. A guy, my neighbor was working at HB, and they suddenly needed more writers, so got a chance to pitch at Fox for X-Men.
Oh, after we left Disney.
Yeah, after we left I did a year of supervised producing on Beetlejuice for Fox. And the executives there, they just started the Fox network. It was brand new, it was tiny, it was barely started, and they in fact had bought Beetlejuice from ABC. It wasn't even an original show of theirs.
Right.
And people there, Margaret Lesh and Sidney Eiwander, I'd worked for Sidney late my first year in the business when he was working for a Japanese company called TMS. And I was his development staff for 9 months. So he knew me and gave me the opportunity to see if I could work on Beetlejuice, and that worked out for a year. The opportunity came up when X-Men was going to start. So that's how, the night before it was greenlit, we get the call and say, we want you to run the X-Men show. So that was the roundabout way of doing it, working on a couple things with the Fox executive before the opportunity came around.
So they knew you were a known factor there. And
yeah.
Talking Disney Afternoon and Beetlejuice, you guys are talking my Saturday mornings as a kid.
Absolutely. For real.
Aw, we love hearing that. We each of us found our way into what became. I just wanted to be a writer. I didn't care. First opportunity, children's TV animation, and we've been fortunate enough to keep at it for these last several years.
That's awesome. Something that we know from your book previously on X-Men
Yes.
is that Margaret Loesch pushed for a serialized version of this show, and she even put her job on the line to get it done, which I think is fascinating. Could you talk to us about that and like the experience of starting a show under those kinds of pressures?
Okay, just to set the stage, because you sound a little younger. Back in the olden days, there were only 3 networks, and the rest were syndicated channels, depending on where you lived in the country. You had ABC, NBC, CBS. Fox was in 1989, 1990. It was just getting started. It was trying to become an actual network, which is weird to look back 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But it was brand new, and there had never been a successful 4th network in 50 years of television. But they didn't stick. It was a really unusual situation where you had the right people in charge, meaning Margaret Loesch and the folks she had with her there, who were also willing to try and be a little different in order to get noticed, get discovered by people. Yeah, it was a big deal.
So it's a great time to be with a corporation because they haven't gotten too big and fat with management yet. They're young and scrappy, and they're trying to get noticed, and they're willing to take risks. And so you've got Margaret with Sydney as her lieutenant, working under her, supervising the shows, pushing the shows to make them as dramatic and compelling and watchable as you can. And as she wanted to differentiate herself from the other 3 networks, which she's really able to do. So that was that was really luck on our part. Fox 10 years later was no different than the other networks, and the executives were no different, and X-Men wouldn't have worked. But at the time, it was a chance they were willing to take. And we were talking about the serialization. That came even more from the creative people. Will Mineo, specifically, the supervising producer who designed the show.
That's on the art side.
Yeah, on the art side. Yeah. So he and Larry Houston are huge comic book fans, and 2 main art supervisors involved. Just thought, comics are serialized. We want to make the show as much like comics as we can. And from the writing point of view, for myself and for Mark Edens, who was the co-head writer for the first 2 seasons, setting up the first 26 stories, we really are fans of big, epic stories. We love miniseries and dramatic series that go on 20, 30 episodes, and let the characters build like a big novel. And so we love the idea. Will loved the idea, and Margaret got it and pushed her bosses for it and paid the price for it, because the big problem with animation back then, it took so long, and you didn't know if it was going to, for months and months and months, if it was going to look any good, or if you had to fix something, or if an episode wasn't working, and then you'd have delays. It would take a month or 2 to fix it. So that happened on the first season, and that's why it was delayed starting for 4 months. And the main reason was getting the animation right took that much time. And 99% of the shows we get to work on, we don't get to work in a serialized storytelling form. One of the reasons they tell us is if we get a bad episode in, then we can just put it aside and put a random other episode in, and nobody's left hanging.
Right.
And they have this idiot idea that kids couldn't keep track of a storyline.
Right. That was.
And so that one of the things that calmed the head network guy down was said, we'll put this previously an X-Men thing at the head. Find them like now shows naturally do, and we're all used to it by now. But at the time, it was really kind of unusual and radical. They did it a little bit in anime. They did, for Bullwinkle in 1960. It really wasn't part of the consciousness of what programming executives were used to allowing. And we pushed it and pushed it and pushed it. And luckily, when the thing became a huge hit, they kind of forgave us for the delays, but it had cost them enough money with the delays that they tried to pull back from it after that first season.
Yeah, I was trying to recall from my memory anything before the first X-Men cartoon where it was serialized, and I came up with not a lot. I mean, even like the Transformers and G.I. Joes, those were the big ones in the 80s, but they were still very episodic. Were there shows you were looking to as a precedence, or was it just like, this is new territory?
From the writer's side, we were just treating it like Hill Street Blues. We were treating it like a primetime drama.
Right.
And there was also the realization that, Eric, when you were hired for this, as excited as everyone was, there was absolutely no real hope that it was going to be a hit.
Right.
So you were hired for 13 episodes, one and done, and that was going to be it. And it was like, you get to tell 13 stories, pick your best, strongest stories. This is probably all it's going to be.
Besides liking comic books, I think the people on the art side were huge. I mean, we were a little bit, but we're huge fans of anime. And anime had some, 100 episode long things going on back in the early to mid 80s that drifting over here in Japanese, and the artists were loving the way they looked and liking the fact that it was this continuing story. So there was a little bit of precedent there that allowed them to feel comfortable with the idea.
Right.
But as I say, for me and the other writers, it was just this is the way adults do it at 10 p.m. With continuing dramas. Why can't we do it? And so we just dove in and said, this is what we want, and luckily they let us do it.
Yeah. One thing I took away from this recent rewatch, Hilary and I just did it the first season, is how cohesive the universe is in this first season, because you're combining characters and stories from all over the decades, from the 60s to the 80s, and then relatively new characters in the 90s, like Cable and Bishop, but it all kind of, in this 13 episodes, it all feels like it was meant to work together from the start. How do you go about making the decisions of those characters and stories, and like the challenges at that time, 30, 40 years of history?
And also when Eric got the call to go in the next day for a meeting, and he was told it's going to be about X-Men. There was no internet. There was no Google.
Yeah.
There was no library to run to start picking up issues. And you only had 9 months from the day of that phone call to the presumed air date, and it was going to be 7 months to get the whole thing developed, written, drawn, storyboarded, everything.
Oh, wow.
And the honest truth was, you and I both didn't know the X-Men.
Yeah.
It was a steep
I think something that actually ended up helping us was Mark Edens and I, who were laying out those 13 stories, the fact that we didn't know the X-Men and had no expectations and had no agenda and had no favorite characters and had no favorite stories that we're pushing, that we're dying to show, or had no stories that we hated that we're trying to keep out of the series. We were surrounded by people that had 30 years of X-Men memorized. So we had a reference library living and breathing. And then, as you may have read in the book, Larry Houston gave me a copy of the Marvel Universe.
photocopy.
Photocopy, sure. Okay.
It was this wonderfully huge encyclopedia that had, if you're trying to figure out who Rogue was, it had every story she was in, what her powers had been. If she was used 3 or 4 different ways, as a good person, as a bad person, as a young person, as a weak person, as a powerful person. It had her, it was like the Cliff Notes. It had really concise history of everybody and how they felt and interacted with the other characters. So I went through and just marked that thing up and used it as a Bible to try to be true to these characters, while at the same time we were just the primary focus was to tell what we thought were the best animated heroic adventure stories we could tell, using bits and pieces from this universe. And that's why they come from so many places. We're looking to pick one over the other,
with the exception of Days of Future Past.
Yeah, with the exception about halfway through developing it, someone came up with the idea of Days of Future Past. It might have been Larry, it might have been Bob Harris at Marvel, but somehow we talked to Marvel and they said, yeah, they'd let us try that. Because we said, can we fit it in with 2 or 3 different characters that will keep it within our team, but keep the same basic story.
Right.
So aside from that one, we were just trying to get, 13 episodes that begin and end with, you find out about the Sentinels, what a horrible problem they are, who's behind it, and episode 13 is resolved by Master Mold being exploded. Right. And it seems like everything's fine. So that was the 13th. Within that, we had that as the backbone of the thing, and then we just were trying to say, okay, let's make sure to have an episode that focuses heavily on Rogue, make sure to have one focus heavily on Storm, make sure to introduce these characters in depth during the season, because oddly, thinking back, as we were told, 85% of our audience didn't know who the X-Men were or what a mutant was back in '92. So we had the task of not only telling 13 good stories, but establishing this world piece by piece by piece by piece. Mark was all frustrated. He did an awful lot of the first, laying out of this world in the first 13. And then in the second and third seasons, there were some more fun stories that went off in tangents. Right. And he said, I did all that foundation work, he was taking off to other jobs, so he chance to do that many more after that. But that was part of the deal. Was
he helped build the house, but he didn't get to live in it.
Yeah, exactly.
I take it as high praise that, and hearing from folks like you as fans, that the X-Men animated series feels like such an honest adaptation of the X-Men material, but there were not very many direct adaptations of specific stories, and I think that just speaks to everyone who worked on this show really doing their darndest to be true to the material, translating it into a new medium.
I'm really glad to hear all those moving parts, because something that we've commented about so many times in our kind of rewatch aspects of the podcast is how successfully you managed to do that. The overarching story and the episodic elements to it. One of the most successful seasons in that regard that I can remember seeing. While we're also talking about structuring and writing, I'm interested to hear about working with a writing team, which I know is very common in television, but doing things like having you, Julia, write Days of Future Past, the first one, and then you've got other people writing the second half of it. How do you kind of juggle those kinds of plans and collaborating, and how does that kind of process work?
I'll tell you, the train had left the station by the time it came along for episodes 11 and 12, right? Yeah. I had been fortunate, as most of the writers were at that point. We were involved very early on with, in this X-Men process, and I was seeing Eric and Mark work literally every day on our dining room table on this show. When it came time to, we weren't even sure if Marvel was, the story Days of Future Past is such an important one that we weren't sure Marvel was going to say, yes, we can do that. So it was called
Future Tense.
Future Tense. It was going to be a two-parter called Future Tense.
Okay.
And it wasn't until later in the process that Marvel was feeling more comfortable with how the series was adapting the property that they then let us, in spite of what is truly a remarkable deviation. Kitty Pryde was never a part of the X-Men animated series team. We weren't just sending someone's mind back to a character. We were sending a whole person back and having that person be someone who was not a member of the team. The coming together of that story was people like Larry Houston, who were so well versed in the in the material. Well, who would be a time traveler that's part of the X-Men experience that could work here, coming up with some options, and one of them was the use of Bishop, and that's.
Yeah, well, and Hilary, to answer your question, in keeping it all focused and keeping the tone together and keeping that was kind of all on me. If you look at it, 76 episodes, the 5 years, and I only took one, written by credit.
Okay, right.
That was episode 47, where we threw a script out, and they needed a new one over the weekend, and someone had to write it for free. So,
oh boy!
But all the other ones, I felt I was very much part of every step of the way. I would usually choose the story. I would always be the one that would be pitching it to the executives and to Marvel to see if they'd give the thumbs up or not, as far as which ones. So, if we did 76 episodes, we probably pitched 500 or 600 stories to them. And these are the 76 that we went with, that everybody agreed were the strongest. So from the very beginning on those 13 stories, I was involved in deciding what the basic story was. And then a premise, 2-page premise would come into me. I would
from the writer.
The
writer be assigned.
I would polish it to keep it, kind of consistent with the series. Send it in, get everybody's notes, put all those notes in, or keep them out if they were terrible, and shepherd it to the next stage, to the 10-page outline stage,
which is the writer's responsibility.
The writer wrote the outline, but again, if it wasn't kind of what I thought the series needed to be, I would polish it. I would change the outline, sometimes 2%, sometimes 80%, and it would go in again and go through the whole round of people. And then the same thing with the script. And the writers would give me a first draft, and I did all the polishes after that. So the way that it stayed kind of on course, I think, that it stayed cohesive, was the fact that it was my computer and my taste at every one of the half dozen stages of each script. And with some writers, it was wonderful. I'd get in a 40-page script and there wouldn't be a word to change, and I just loved it. I said, great, I've got a weekend free. Wonderful. But sometimes there weren't, and the way the consistency was, and not all shows are run necessarily this way, but it was kind of like each episode was my responsibility, so it had to read like something that I enjoyed and I felt was consistent.
You talking about replacing Kitty Pryde with Bishop in the Days of Future Past. And one thing I've been kind of commenting on as we've been watching it to Hilary is that, and like realizing it myself, because when I first watched this cartoon, I didn't really think about it. Now, knowing the history of the comics, like there are characters like Cable and Bishop and Gambit and Jubilee, like you were mentioning having those encyclopedia to look through, but these are still like characters that would have been only 2 or 3 years old in the comics when you guys were starting the show. So they have... either they have very little history, or a lot of their history hasn't even been mapped out in the comics. I mean, does that give you guys a freedom to put your own stamp on them, or is that its own kind of complications?
It did. It gave us a freedom. Obviously, we were constantly checking with Marvel and had 2 people, Bob Harris and Joe Calamari, giving us notes from Marvel. But you're right. I mean, Gambit was brand new, and Cable was brand new, and it was a little frustrating because we were under such time pressure, and we'd write and ask you, he'd write. He would have to write Marvel in New York City. Yeah, you have to fax. There was no email.
Right.
And offices closed 5 o'clock on Friday.
So I'd have to fax to these guys and say, we'd like to have Gambit in a situation where they think could be a traitor. Does that fit his character? Does this and this and this and this? Because you're right, there were no Gambit comic books to look at. He was a brand new guy that they were pushing, like Cable was, that they were trying to figure out. And I swear I went through 2 or 3 seasons before I quite knew who Cable was or how he fit in to their universe, because I was hearing 3 or 4 different things from people. How good is he? How bad is he? Who does he care about? Who's he connected to? This was all an ongoing new thing. And you're right. Professor Xavier is easy.
Right.
Although even there, you couldn't have him, we didn't have him deal with the Holocaust because we thought that would make him be 85 years old.
Right.
So we just said the books were written in the early 60s. This was early 90s. So we had to update 30 years in some people's histories.
The only challenge has been, getting a chance to hear from fans and stuff. And people who may take issue with the team that was selected ultimately to be X-Men the Animated Series, and to the purist back then, Jubilee is no Kitty Pryde, and Gambit is new, but those were also sort of corporate decisions that those characters were new, and they wanted them at the forefront of this new thing that might or might not work.
Well, I mean, at the time, someone like Cable was as hot as it can get in the comics. It was like putting him on a comic book cover was printing money. So
we just needed to figure out how to fit him in.
Right. Sure.
He wasn't an X-Men.
I love hearing about that, because one of my favorite things about this first season is how he just sort of pops in, and it works out to make him just sort of a mysterious kind of character. But it's funny to hear that you were also kind of trying to figure out where exactly does he fit.
when you were talking about how a lot of the people on the art side were being influenced by like anime that was coming to the States now, well, we were watching it and we noticed that there's different stylistic techniques with the animation. There's like very striking moments and action places. Like in the very last episode, there's Wolverine by himself with the Sentinels, and there's that strobe light effect with the Sentinel blaster. There's also a scene where like you're looking at a puddle and you see Wolverine jump down in it and you realize it's a reflection. So there's all these like really interesting animation techniques. Where do those scenes start? Does a writer put that in? Is it the director? Is it storyboard artist? How does that happen?
It's all of the above. And it's strange. We've been out here in Hollywood forever, and we have a lot of screenwriter friends that are very frustrated in live action because 90% of that stuff's left up to the director and the actors on the set. In animation, we describe all that. Our scripts are longer. We try to describe what all the action is and who's doing what to whom and where they are, and we try to choreograph it on the paper as much as we can for the sake. The artists have to draw these 900 image storyboards fast, by hand, and some of them are very intricate. So we got to do a lot more of that. TV has such time constraints. There's not a lot of time for improvisation at any stage. Either, you hand a script to the storyboard artist, he and the director, Larry Houston would hire all the storyboard artists and he would direct how the boards came out. And so much of the best episodes, you could see it in the storyboards that it's the way it's choreographed on the boards is the way it comes out on, because once it gets overseas, it's going really fast.
Right.
And there's not
hands.
Much. Again, no time or budget to change anything.
Right.
Basically, all that happens overseas is some stuff gets left out because it's too ambitious or too expensive. So 98% of what you see in those scenes either was written by the writer or was drawn by the storyboard artist under the supervision of Larry, the director.
Right.
So that's really all in there. If you flip through a storyboard, you could actually pretty much follow, beat by beat, moment by moment, look by look, gesture by gesture, what ends up in the 22-minute episode.
Right.
And a thing that I had not really appreciated until later, because again, I was not on the art side of this, but there was a genuine effort to honor the air quotes here, comic book look of the X-Men.
Sure.
And that involved your basic background, then your character cells, and then also an overlay of heavy black lines and shadows and shapes to make it pop like an image in a comic book.
And all that costs money and time,
right,
which just drove our production people crazy.
Right.
I mean,
and the special shots, the effects, you don't think about it. You're saying, oh, it's a cartoon. There are hundreds of special effect shots in X-Men. And it's like, well, that someone just drew that. No. It's you got to do a special technique here and use special lighting over here. And this was all, again, it was all hand drawn. This is back in the days before computer animation. Every color had to be
adjusted.
It's staggering.
And called out and said, when an explosion happens in the left corner, all the entire color palette changes to the right part of the screen and today that just means hitting a couple buttons on a program. That meant 15 people overseas who are painting on plastic. Getting different pots of paint and making the colors just slightly different to the left.
Amazing. As
the explosion happens.
Right.
It just was. I'm stunned. And you're talking about some of the amazing things that came across. As Larry would tell you, there was a variety. It happened so fast. There would be on the writing side. There were 20 different people that ended up working as writers over the 76 episodes. And obviously some were stronger than others. And the same thing with storyboard artists. I would try to, pick the right writer for the right story. Larry would try to pick the right artists he'd do 3 artists per story, per episode, because there's so much drawing to be done. And he'd pick, ones that are good with action for the big action acts, and others, better with character for the other ones. Each person, we try to cast it that way as it went along. And then we'd get overseas, and there would be A, B, and C level animation crews over there. So you wouldn't know. You would hope and fingers crossed that if it was an ambitious thing like Days of Future Past, that you'd get an A crew,
Yeah.
but there's no way to bribe or
Right.
assure, that you might not get a C crew. And so you have had your A people writing it, your A people drawing it, and then you get your C people animating it, and
Yeah.
it's luck of the draw on this. Now there was on Days of Future Past, Larry and Will, who were like the two head people in charge of the art side of the whole process, were just so excited that episode was going to be that story was going to be told. Right. They didn't let anybody from the storyboard group of artists do it. They did it themselves. Okay. And that's why the opening looks so cool. I mean, that's just Will Mineo going crazy.
Right.
And he did like the first 15 seconds of the opening titles. He and Larry did it, and so you could get a sense of the way Will storyboard stuff. It's like nonstop action.
Sure.
It keeps swooping through. It swoops through here, it swoops through there, it swoops through there, and suddenly there's someone else in the foreground and someone else in the background. And it's a style that he has. And he did, like I say, the first, 5 minutes, 5, 6, maybe 10 minutes of
dark version
whatever.
Of New York.
Yeah, the first part of Days of Future Past.
Yeah.
So.
I have one more question about the story for season 1. Something I've really loved a lot about that season is how Magneto shows up at the beginning, like 3rd and 4th episodes, and then he just vanishes until the finale.
We don't see him for 9 episodes.
9 episodes. I feel like that was a very strong choice for the overarching narrative, and I wonder if there was any trouble holding on to that with a lot of earlier cartoons having basically just one big villain. He keeps showing up, but what are we going to do about him this time? And was that something that you got pushed to, or were you just locked in? Magneto's not coming back till the end because we need to have this big moment.
Yeah, was Marvel or Fox pushing like you have to have Magneto every episode?
Well, there's 2 different stages to that. But at the very beginning, when we laid out the 13 stories and handed in the show Bible, if it's in the book, there was a big crisis because there was an executive at Marvel.
Oh my God!
That felt very much that way. Oh no! Magneto's our biggest villain. The Sentinels aren't nearly interesting enough to keep this going. You need to redo all these stories. And we talked him out of that, partially because it makes sense to people in animation. The Sentinels are much more. Our Wolverine can't slash up Magneto.
Right.
No.
Can't slash anybody.
Correct.
He can slash up Sentinels. And they also were a much better metaphor for humanity's oppression of mutants, which is what we wanted to focus on. This Marvel guy didn't understand that. He was just into, who's the villain of the week, which is, we've been involved in other action adventure shows. It really gets tiresome to, who's going to be the bad guy twirling his mustache this week? So we didn't want that. We didn't want it to be one bad guy threatening the Smurfs for 97 episodes.
Right.
It's just there's so many interesting characters and so many interesting villains in the universe that we wanted, as new people to it, as the writers, we wanted to showcase them all. We wanted to establish this world, and you can't showcase Apocalypse and Mr. Sinister and Omega Red. You can't, you can't establish the 20 most interesting villains by just having Magneto every week. It becomes so narrow a thing. And if I were an audience member, well, Magneto has his moment. You figure out what's driving him. End of episode. Okay, who's next? Why repeat, the same thing, over and over and over and over again? And
I think, too, second part of that was that Pride of the X-Men had tried to make that happen. The one-off that Margaret Lesh and Will Mineo and Larry Houston,
a lot of talented people,
a lot of really talented folks, when they were at Marvel itself, trying to get the X-Men, trying to get one of the networks to buy the show. Right. That was their sort of, calling card saying, hey, look what we can do. But they were not all in charge at that point, and people above them said, well, you got to show all the bad mutants, and you got to show all the good mutants, because that's how they're going to sell toys. And by the time you got through with that, as Eric sometimes, it kind of becomes like WWE, which I love. It's that awkward reset. Okay, they're just going to charge at each other again next week.
Right.
I think when those folks moved to production and to Fox Kids, I think the decision to change the angle of attack on this and as Eric said, the humanities issue with mutants, I think set up such a broader story for everything. It's just it became to me a much deeper sort of tale as a result.
Well, I mean, also as like a fan of the characters, it stops somebody from, like Magneto, from being like diminished every week, where you just stop seeing him as a threat because he's there every week, so of course he's gonna lose. But if he's only showing up like maybe once or twice a season, it's a big deal because with your guys' Magneto. At the time in the comics, I think Marvel was refocusing him as the arch-villain. But in the cartoon, he's very much more of an anti-hero, good intentions, but maybe wrong actions, reserving somebody like Magneto, keeping him there for the episodes he needs to be in was a smart choice.
And his relationship with Charles just it breaks my heart. There are still moments when I'll catch an episode and it's like, oh my God. Yeah. They truly are each other's best friends and biggest enemies.
I was just talking about that in our last recording of it because there's the episode, the season 4, the Deadly Reunions, where Magneto is blowing up a chemical plant to bring Xavier out, and there's this moment where Magneto is like, I wonder what you'll look like, Charles. Will you have a goatee? And it's this, he's trying to bring out Xavier so he can deal with him, but he's also just kind of excited to see his old friend. Yeah. There's a lot there. You mentioned choosing the Sentinels because they represent the human threat and everything. The first season, anybody who watches the first season, it's very focused on the core X-Men message about unity, diversity, anti-bigotry, oppression, from the first to the last episode, so much so when you do Days of Future Past, it's all you're previously on at the beginning is just all these silent scenes from the previous episodes. You don't have to do any legwork because all those episodes have already done it. And those themes are so important with the X-Men, but they're also pretty heavy at times. I mean, the Days of Future Past episodes are pretty heavy for something that is on Fox Kids at the time. How important was that to you? With the serialized show, and where you're doing it 13 episodes, and it's serialized so it's not episodic, is that harder to maintain that focus of those themes, or is it easier because every episode is leading into the next?
Well, it was we've mentioned before, it was sort of a magic time at Fox Kids, and the marching orders as a writer on the show from Margaret Lesh and Sidney Iwander, you do not write down to kids, you write up. Think of this as an hour-long live-action primetime drama. It happens to be a half-hour animated show that'll air on Saturday morning or in the afternoon. We were charged from the folks in charge to be as candid, as honest, as tough as we could be, given what there were still parameters, and there are still things you can't do on Saturday morning. If you'll notice in the pilot episode, in the first two-parter, when the Jet's returning after they've lost Morph and Beast, and Wolverine comes out and punches Cyclops, and then says, next time I use these, and pulls out his claws. That was a big argument. That was not an argument, but that was a big discussion that Eric had. That was
the one time we got to have one of our characters hit somebody.
Because you can't do imitatable behavior for children's TV. There's a
right.
We couldn't have realistic guns. We couldn't have bleeding.
Correct.
Just if somebody's helicopter was blown out of the sky, you need to see him. Parachute. I mean, within all these children's programming restrictions that we had. In fact, we cut the word death out about 400 times because our censor didn't care for it. So a lot of stuff was going to be destroyed.
Right. I can't kill you. I will kill you. I will destroy you.
I think part of it was that we came to it thinking like we were, like I said, we were making a primetime drama or a movie.
Sure.
And in our heads. And so there are all sorts of things we couldn't show. The sex and violence we couldn't show kind of got translated into cranking up the intensity of everything else around it. The whole yelling and screaming and yearning and having their hearts broken.
Sure.
And so the melodrama and the emotional intensity got cranked up so that people that would, let's say, be watching an actual adult show, wouldn't be feeling like, oh, I'm watching a little kid show where they're kind of at these things. We wanted the stuff to be real, and we wanted, as we told Margaret the first week, these characters you've handed us are mostly around 30 years old, and they're idealistic, or they're heroic, they're tragic, and you can't play at that. You can't do that pretend. Either you go whole hog for that and believe in it, or you don't. And so that's why we took it all so very seriously. There are dramatic action shows in primetime that treated their violence and their actions in a silly kind of wink, nudge, nudge. Oh, we're really all kind of playing at this. Nobody's really getting hurt.
Right.
Kind of way. And that just was an anathema to us.
I want to give a shout out here to the broadcast standards and practices person at Fox Kids at the time, a woman named Avery Coburn. Honest to gosh, if it had been a different person, who knows if X-Men would have worked or would have lasted or gotten on the air, because she was the person who had absolute control over whether something ran or didn't.
Right.
Whether killed more, whether we got to do an episode about Wolverine and Nightcrawler and God.
Whether Wolverine could punch Cyclops in the stomach.
Yeah.
Every one of those discussions had to go through Avery. When you get into season 2, you will notice the magic world of Savage Land, and we found a memo where between Sydney Iwander and Avery Coburn where a dinosaur falls into a volcano and carnage is happening, and so people are fighting, things are happening, and Avery's note back was, okay, you can have this fight here, you can do that there, but I need to see the dinosaur climb out of the volcano. And Sydney was going, you do realize they are extinct, No. That wasn't good. But so those are the kind of things that that she had to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, she would be in on from the premise, the outline, the script, and a certain amount of trust had to be built up.
Yeah.
So that we weren't trying to sneak things past her.
Right.
You had to be absolutely honest with her, and we would pre-tell her before we'd start on it, like on the Nightcrawler script before we wrote a word of it. We said, "Oh, this is what we're planning to do. Let's talk about what the limits are and what some of the problems could be." We have the writer write it all and have you make him cut it all out. So it was a good working relationship.
Okay.
And if there were some things where I misjudged it, I could get 3 single-spaced pages worth of notes about things that were freaking her out and things that needed to be changed or cut out or redone. And we would then have that moment where Julie and I always refer to as a Star Trek meme, get me that third alternative.
Right.
Scotty or Bones or, gentlemen, I need that third alternative. Because neither, what we were suggesting was absolutely undoable for her. What she was suggesting as replacement would be absolutely undoable for us. And we'd have to find a middle ground that would achieve what we needed but wouldn't offend her. And 99 out of 100 times we found it. It's an art form. It's an art figuring out that level of diplomacy and reimagining the scene in a way that ends up being just as dramatic, but is missing the horrifying thing that's bothering her.
I noticed a shot in The Final Decision. It's where they discover that Magneto is still alive after being beaten up and crushed by the Sentinels. His whole midsection is really scuffed up, and it looks pretty bloody. And I was kind of shocked you were able to get away with that.
I think a couple things drifted through. Like there was an early one where Wolverine is hurt by Sabretooth, and there's a little bit of the blood on the bandages. But,
and he has bandages.
And we were told after that, no more bandages. Just like something would slip through, and she'd realize that the animators or the artists had drawn it, more graphically than she'd imagined it. And then we'd get a note in retrospect saying, well, I won't make you cut that out of the episode, which happened. I mean, there were cases where something would come back and we just have to cut to an alternative, cut to somebody's reaction shot. There's not a lot of extra footage in animation. You can't just so you cut back to a reaction shot from one of the other characters from previous episode or something. There were things like that would drift through, and then she'd catch them, and then we wouldn't do them again.
And that was also part of the time where we weren't even sure what Wolverine's powers were ultimately. Like, how fast could he heal?
Right.
You know, that was something that we're kind of figuring out.
Sure.
Yeah.
As the season went along.
Yeah, and we very, very much wanted it to be that he wasn't Superman, that he was, that if someone just came and, shot a bullet in his eye, he'd die, as opposed to, in the movies, he became pretty much invulnerable.
Yeah, sure.
Which is fine for some other characters, but for our character, we didn't want someone that just could never be hurt, because then they're never in jeopardy.
Right.
So we made it take longer for him to heal up than do in the movies.
Yeah.
In addition to all those really heavy themes that you got to skate through, I also wanted to talk about what the show did for female characters and placing women as real people and also real forces in the narrative and in the world that they're placed in. I know some of that comes from the comics, with characters like Storm and Rogue having such overwhelming powers, but the show has those and also lacks the harmful elements like the blatant sexualization that happens in the comics. And it seemed to be very purposeful in what it was doing for the female characters, and for sort of feminist themes. We're presented with different kinds of female experiences and strengths. With Storm and Rogue and Jubilee, they're all very different kinds of women, and the president is a woman. I was really excited to see.
Thank you very much for noticing that.
Yes, I loved that. Yeah, I would just love to hear more about that from your perspective.
First of all, X-Men itself, the source, had 30 years of a bunch of interesting and some not so interesting characters to pull from. And you had Margaret Lesh at the top of Fox Kids, who had always, when she was working for Marvel, always really, really, really loved the X-Men as a property and wanted to see it done.
And believed that it was just as exciting for girls watching as for boys, because that was one of the arguments. Well, boys action adventure, which is what the genre is called, tends to be like 80-20. Boys watching, girls watching, and X-Men was more like 55-45.
Right. I know there's that thing that girls don't buy the toys.
Right.
It's sad that 30 years later we're still having that conversation.
Sure.
You know, the needle hasn't moved very much in that regard. Interestingly, if I'm remembering this correctly, because you guys had to choose the team ultimately. And the beauty part, looking back on it, it just so happened that Storm and her powers, to me, she's the strongest X-Men. She will always be your best offense-defense player. Everyone wants to be Wolverine, because you get to run up to somebody and smack them with your claws. But in war, you send Storm up to either dust bowl them out or freeze them or rain them out. You know, but none of her crazy powers took anything away from any of the other characters, male or female. And that was across the board. Even Rogue, who presumably, I guess you'd argue, is the strongest on that team, non-telepathically, because I think you could argue Jean Grey. But all of them had immense power, but it was always balanced, I think, with real soulful personal contradictions and issues. You know, if my argument, if Wolverine had had Rogue's powers, and if Rogue swapped with Wolverine, they'd both be perfectly happy, because he could go run in the woods and never touch anybody again, and and she could touch somebody and she wouldn't have to gouge him with her claws, and she'd be happy.
Right.
So in a way, each of them, every one of the characters, the thing that made them the best at being that X-Men was also the thing that they struggled with the most personally, internally.
You know, we weren't self-consciously trying to be feminist in terms of the balance of the team, but I think the nice thing was that in seriously trying to pick the team, none of the people above us, obviously the head of the network's a woman, or head of the children's network's a woman, so you're not getting pushback from her, and you're not getting the merchandising people kicking you and screaming and saying it needs to be 6 Smurfs and a Smurfette because sales. So you're not getting any of that pressure. So we just basically started with a clean slate in terms of picking the team. And luckily, the interest of Marvel was picking the people they either thought were brand new and they wanted to push, or they thought core historical characters and maybe that would help them sell the comic books, because they'd never made any money off of TV shows before, and they'd never had movies. So all they were thinking about was comic books. They said, okay, who's the best group of 7 or 8 people that we could make money off in the books, and the network, as far as the network instincts, would say, oh, well, who would be the most interesting characters to grab an audience. It's in the previous on X-Men book. We were given about half a dozen to start with. Xavier, because he had to be there, but they thought he was kind of a minor character. Wolverine was obviously everybody's number one choice because the world loved him. And Gambit was a new guy they're pushing. Jubilee's a new person they're pushing. And Storm and Cyclops were two real powerful characters from the very beginning of the show. That was the core. They didn't talk that much about Jean Grey. They didn't talk much about Beast. And Morph we made up to kill. So as it happened, we found in writing it just characters like Jean asserted themselves and Beast asserted himself that we found it easier to tell a better story. She became involved in the problems. Because she had this interesting relationship with all of them that nobody else did. Jubilee didn't know everybody. Wolverine didn't bother to learn. Understand everybody.
Sure.
Empathy. She was in the middle. This heart that held the whole family together. And it's like if there were a grave crisis, every single person would turn to her in a different way. She had this. There were things about the characters that, as we wrote the first 13. We ended up with the batch we did, and we had pushed really hard to have them as different from each other as we could, as distinct.
Sure, yeah.
So it wasn't, Bishop and Colossus and Wolverine and Cable as the X-massive guys. It was this range of people with range of histories. And in doing that, I think part of it ended up being, the most interesting characters and the most animatable characters ended up being female. And so it was an unconscious result having it ended up 50-50 as far as the gender representation.
I'm so surprised to hear it because it was so prevalent and so effective. So whatever unconscious things were happening for you, it worked out. I was very pleased to see it.
Yeah, it's evident from the very first episode in the mall where it's Storm, Rogue, and Jubilee are the ones taking down the Sentinel.
And Gambit's off flirting with the gal at the card shop. What the?
Yeah.
But that's again, introducing them and sort of, you're not sure who Gambit's going to turn out to be. Will he be there for you or not? Right there in that opening,
This is my last question. We were watching the last few episodes, the Days of Future Past. We did our episode for that a couple of weeks ago. We just recently did the Final Decision one, and Final Decision opens up with protest and riots, and Xavier's talking about if we don't stop these Sentinels now, it's going to create a civil war in this country, and hate is going to spread out. And I'm sitting there watching it, and I'm just like, this was only a couple days ago, and it is not, it's not escapism as we tend to think of like our big action adventure shows. It's unfortunately very relatable today, and what does that mean to you guys? Because you were doing this in 1993, and unfortunately, all these years later, it's maybe even more important. The messages happening in this show, and metaphorical it can be at times.
My line is, did we teach you people nothing? We tried, man. No, but I think sadly, and this world today is the proof that there are those kinds of ugly, horrible hatreds out there, just under different guises, under different names. It's incumbent on all of us to be aware of that and do what we can to fight back as best we can. And I think the X-Men themselves represent the perfect sort of metaphor for the group that other people look at with fear because they don't understand. They don't know them, and can therefore dismiss them more easily. It's terrifying how timely it can be still.
Well, you said that, did we teach you people nothing? I started watching this show when I was 14. They were showing it on reruns when the first X-Men movie was coming out, because I didn't know anything about the X-Men. So the first movie comes out, and this show is on reruns, and I'm getting into the comics, and Hilary and I just recorded our Final Decision episode. And after doing that and watching that episode, I'm like, I can't be a fan and just sit here and act like I've learned nothing. So like the next day I had to go out to a peaceful protest and at least be counted, because I feel like if I'm just saying I'm a fan of this but just sitting on my couch watching it, then I'm I'm ignoring the message here. So, even at 34 watching the Final Decision, I'm like, well, this is unfortunately topical, but there's a message here that I have to respond to.
My gosh, Eric, that means so much to us to hear you say that it gave you that, not incentive, motivate. I don't know what the right word is, but I'm glad you responded to it. I really truly am, and it's humbling.
I've been telling Hilary how much I love watching this first season, because it always strikes me as the perfect showcase to show somebody who doesn't know anything about the X-Men. These 13 episodes. You hand it to them. Even the movies, you kind of have to explain certain things and whatnot. But these 13 episodes, I've always thought of, like, if I need to remind myself what the X-Men are about or why I like the X-Men, you can just watch this first season. And, like, Eric, like you said, in future episodes, you get to do more bigger, maybe fun stories, delve into the world. But, like, this for 13 episodes is like, this is the X-Men. And so, thank you guys for taking this stuff so seriously back then, because, as kids we liked it, and as adults it still sticks with us. That's the reason why, Hilary is doing this podcast with me, because she watched this show when she was younger.
Yep. Eric was like, do you want to do an X-Men podcast? And I was like, can we do the animated series?
Yeah. And thank you for being on this podcast. And I know both of you have mentioned the book previously on X-Men a couple times, if you want to talk about that.
My shtick is Star Trek has Paramount.
Uh-huh.
Batman has Warner Brothers in terms of studio support, but Dear X-Men, the animated series, became the child of a very ugly divorce when Marvel went through bankruptcy and things were sold off. And it was about, 5 years ago that I started agitating that no one's celebrating the X-Men in advance of what was to have been its 25th anniversary. And kept grumbling, and we happened to have we had the original scripts, we had the original storyboards still in storage.
And a lot of network memos and a lot of details, early attempts at things. So we thought, look, we've got 1,000 pages of extras here. If you don't do the book, nobody's going to do it. We called Marvel, we couldn't even get through. They weren't interested because Fox didn't have half the rights, and Fox wasn't interested because they didn't have half the rights. So it was just an orphan, and okay, well, we'll go ahead and do this. And luckily, we didn't have much work at the time, so we spent a couple of years and called everybody.
Excuse me, is it your life?
That's true. She did support us somewhat, though. But so we called everybody, and there's all this wonderful outpouring of emotion and memories in the book, because for 95% of the people, it was the best job they ever had.
And also, no one was asking them.
There were this entire cast up in Toronto, and nobody had asked him to a con yet. Ever.
That's crazy.
Crazy.
So we got it all together, and luckily, X-Men is big enough that 2 or 3 publishers were interested, but to publish a book without Marvel's permission. We couldn't, if we tried, we couldn't get through. If we got through, they would have probably said no, or they probably would have wanted to manage it. So this is done fair use.
But it's all our materials.
And so it's, in that way, we told it exactly, every word of it, every image, everything is exactly what we wanted to do. It wasn't like, well, this will offend Marvel, or that will reflect badly on somebody that they don't. There no censorship whatsoever. So it's exactly the book we wanted to write.
And it came out in time to be keyed into what was X-Men's 25th anniversary.
Right. So, and it became
which was a big thing for us.
So we've been going to 10 cons a year
now, because it gives us an entree. We had
it helps. We could focus panels on it. We could bring 2 or 3 writers, and Larry Houston, an artist, and recently 3 or 4 of the cast members down from Canada. And so it's been the centerpiece that's for the con experience for us.
Oh, so quickly, if folks would like a copy of previously,
the best way to buy it is through the publisher, because they have hardbound signed copies by me.
They'll sit Eric down with a stack and have him sign them, and then if you order through jacobsbrownmediagroup.com, jacobsbrownmediagroup.com, you can get a signed hardback copy. It is
very cool.
Available through Amazon. It is available through Amazon in different formats. And if you're overseas, if you order through Amazon, that way you can get a print on demand.
Okay.
Because, boy, it's expensive mailing books overseas.
Sure, yep.
I'm sure, yeah.
So, yeah, please check out previously on X-Men through Jacobs Brown Media Group or through Amazon.
Yeah.
And then shortly after the book came out, Eric got a phone call right when Marvel and Disney were coming together.
Right.
And Eric gets a phone call from
there's people say, oh, it's the head of international licensing for Marvel, and we think, oh damn, we thought they're gonna tell us that we shouldn't have done the book.
Right.
So, no, everybody in our office loves the book. It's just that now that Marvel and Fox are getting together and all the rights are coming together, we want to do something else about the animated series and let you use all of the artwork
that we couldn't use.
That we didn't have rights to use, and screenshots or just anything that Marvel Disney owns around the show that we didn't have access to. So the first book is a detailed history of 200,000 words. This new book, which is like a coffee table art book, it's more like 30,000 words, but it's a couple thousand images. It's just full of all sorts of things, wonderful old cells we found. I mean, it's hard. Even in the 90s, basically, when they were done with all that beautiful artwork, all those hand-painted cells, they just throw them away.
Yeah.
Or wash. I don't even know if they bothered washing the plastic anymore, but we had to find stuff in people's basements and storage lockers.
Larry Houston storage lockers.
Wow.
Dusty. And
but we found it. Some of the stuff is astonishing.
Yeah,
Haven't seen it in 30 years.
Luckily, the collectors have started collecting cells. So there was a gallery, Van Eaton, here in Southern California that had a couple hundred cells.
Okay.
Out of the tens of thousands that were drawn, they had a couple that we were able to use a bunch of, and they were very gracious with that.
So this new book is called X-Men: The Art and Making of the Animated Series, and it's coming out through Abrams Books, and it's going to be coming out October 20th, 2020.
Great.
Just in time for your holiday shopping.
Yep.
You can look for it either on the Abrams website, they have it there in their catalog, or you can also look for it again on Amazon if you want to take a look and see what it says so far.
That's exciting.
So we're very excited about that.
Yeah.
If the world were not what the world was right now, we would be planning cons, we'd be going places, we'd be so excited to be out there and talk. But since that's not to be in the cards these days, we hope folks can look for the books and they make great companion pieces if you want to know about the book. And
they are really complimentary. I mean, there's some reference points in the new book, but it's really one is the history and the other is this is how the art was made.
The hardcover of Previously on X-Men, I have that in my house. I love seeing all the notes, especially because you were talking about picking characters and maybe not knowing their histories. Just these quick descriptions, like this is Gambit in a quick sentence. This is just to let everybody know how they're gonna work. It's just interesting to see at that time as this thing's happening. With that retrospect, how you guys were figuring that out at the time. And the interviews with the voice actors is a lot of fun. All that stuff is it's like a gold mine of stories in there.
And also, if folks can, please, we have a website, xmentas.com for X-Men, the animated series.com, where we post blogs we're on, and we'll do this too. And we have various posts and articles and things there. Also, I tend to be on Twitter way too much at our Twitter site, which is X-Men TAS, also X-Men the Animated Series, and Instagram.
We love your Twitter.
Yep.
So please try and find us. It means a lot to us, and yay.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to do this interview with us. Like you said, the world is pretty crazy right now, but we still appreciate you coming here to answer some of these questions for us and share your time with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. That was the interview.
Wasn't that fun? I had such a fun time with them.
It was a good time. It's something else to I mean, I know the internet and the podcast medium and everything has broken down walls between fans and creators, but it's still wow. That's, and I mean, I told them, but and we've talked about it here before, but when the first X-Men movie came out, I wasn't buying comics yet. So the fact that they were showing these the animated series on reruns in 2000, in the summer of 2000, meant I was getting to, that was my X-Men fix.
Oh yeah.
Besides having seen the first movie in theaters, this was my X-Men fix at the time, and the cartoon is how you got into it. Yeah,
you got in by the movies and I got in by the cartoon. It was I used to go play and pretend to be Rogue with my friend, and she would be Storm, and like way back.
Yeah. I mean, it's still good. We just finished the first season. It's still so good.
It's still so good.
Yeah.
And it just resonates with so many people still, even now. And I feel like that just indicates how, I mean, the themes obviously resonate, but even just how quality it was. It just sticks with you.
And it's so frustrating because we'll watch 2 episodes and then we'll go weeks in between because of the way that we structure the podcast. But it's like, but I want to keep watching it.
I know.
So,
I know. Yeah. Put down the remote.
Yeah. I've said it before in this podcast, that book, the Previously on X-Men book, it's in depth.
I love all the stories you come up with out of that. I'm excited about that new one to see all the pictures. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, I love me a good coffee table book. I've read a couple of coffee table books based off the Batman animated series or...
I'm surprised you don't already somehow have a copy of this.
Of the animated series? Yeah, coffee table, yeah. We pushed this episode up ahead, so actually our next episode we're going to be watching the Deadpool movie, finally.
Yeah.
We're going to do
it's
that
gonna happen.
and talk about that.
I'm going to watch it, and it's going to be fine.
Yes, and then we'll be on our normal schedule again. But we wanted to get the Final Decision episode and our interview with Eric and Julia Lewald episodes out quickly.
Yeah, get it out. We're excited.
Yeah. Hilary, any questions you wanted to ask me? I mean, since we're in this interview...
There were a few times during the interview that I wanted to say something to you, but I couldn't because I couldn't be like, now Eric, because it would have been confusing. I had to stop myself.
It's also, this is our first interview doing it where we're both remote from each other, interviewing somebody remotely. Yeah. So who knows what it'll be like if you and I ever go to a convention and interview somebody in person. We won't know what to do.
I know. We'll be like, were you going to, I was going to
point.
That's fine.
It will just be Night of the Roxbury's, you and I just pointing back like, you hit, hurt me, you hit, hurt me.
Yes.
Right.
It'll come off really well.
Yeah, it'll be great. We'll be super professional. Again, I'm Eric Mickles, Dust vs. Tweak everywhere online. Apart from other shows on the Radio Meanwhile Network, I'm the co-host of the podcast, The All the Book Show. Thank you to Prophetic Music for our theme song. Again, join us next episode to talk about Deadpool, the movie. Again, you can find more about this show and others like it at our network's website, radiomeanwhile.com. Please follow us on Facebook or Twitter at Previously on X. Please rate, subscribe, and share the show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.